The sound of the ceramic plate shattering against the hardwood floor still rang in Margaret Ellis's ears. One moment, she had been sitting quietly at the elegant dinner table, surrounded by strangers, Brianna's colleagues and their well-dressed spouses. And the next, she was standing amidst scattered food, broken porcelain and stunned silence. 20 pairs of eyes stared at her, some wide with pity, others pretending not to look, but not one reached out. Not even her son. Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation. She stood frozen, clutching the napkin in her lap like it could shield her from the shame swelling in her chest. She was 68 years old, a retired librarian, a widow of 10 years, and a grandmother to 2 precious children who were, at this moment, upstairs likely hearing every word. Across the table, her daughter-in-law Brianna stood, arms crossed and jaw set, her face twisted with contempt. "You weren't even invited, Margaret," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You just showed up as usual acting like this is your house." Margaret swallowed hard, willing her voice to stay calm. "Daniel told me about the dinner. I thought." "You thought wrong," Brianna snapped, cutting her off. "You always do." Margaret turned to her son, her only child, hoping for intervention, a word, a look, anything. But Daniel only stared down at his untouched plate, his hands clenched in his lap. "Mom," he muttered under his breath, "let's not make this worse." Her heart cracked in half. There had been a time when Margaret was Daniel's entire world. After her husband passed away suddenly from a stroke, it had been just the two of them. She worked overtime at the library, skipped vacations, and poured every ounce of her being into raising him right. They had weathered life storms hand in hand. Now here he was, grown successful, with a family of his own, and unwilling to defend her from open cruelty in his own home. Brianna waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Please just go. We don't need a scene. Honestly, it's embarrassing." Margaret could barely see through the blur of tears forming behind her glasses. Her voice failed her. She reached for her purse, her dignity unraveling with every step. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her coat, still draped neatly on the arm of the sofa. No one moved. No one offered help. The dinner party, once filled with laughter and clinking wine glasses, had fallen into a stiff, uncomfortable silence. As she walked to the front door, she glanced up the staircase. Her grandsons, 8-year-old Caleb and 6-year-old Ryan, peered down from the landing, their small faces pale with confusion. Caleb whispered something to Ryan, who clutched the banister. That image would stay with Margaret longer than any cruel word Brianna had hurled. What were they learning in that moment? That cruelty was acceptable if done with confidence? That silence was safety. The drive home was a fog of heartbreak and disbelief. Her small house, the one she'd kept since Daniel was a toddler, felt colder than usual. She sat on the couch, still in the same slacks now stained with sauce and wine, and let the tears fall unchecked. A message dinged on her phone. From Daniel. "Sorry about tonight. Brianna's been under a lot of pressure at work. She didn't mean it. Let's give her some space." Space. As if she hadn't spent the last 5 years giving Brianna nothing but space. Reduced visits. Cancelled holidays. "Oh, the boys have a soccer game. We need family time. Next weekend, maybe." And every time, Margaret had smiled, nodded, and stayed quiet. For Daniel's sake. For the boys' sake. Because she thought if she stayed kind, stayed present, they'd see how much she still mattered. Instead, she'd become a burden. An afterthought. A name on a holiday card. She stood and walked into the bathroom. In the mirror, a woman stared back, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed with tears, cheeks hollow with disappointment. This wasn't who she used to be. Margaret Ellis had once commanded quiet just by walking into a room. She had helped generations of children fall in love with books, taught research skills to flustered teens, comforted grieving patrons with a listening ear. She had been respected, seen. When had she stopped demanding that? When had she started believing she didn't deserve it? That night Margaret didn't sleep. She lay awake, the dinner party replaying in her head, over and over, each version more painful than the last. But by dawn something had shifted. Not rage, not revenge, but a quiet voice inside her that whispered no more. She didn't know what she'd do yet, But she knew this. She would no longer stand silently in the background of her own life. Not for Brianna. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone. The morning after the dinner party, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea and staring at the pale light filtering through the curtains. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud, filled with memories she had tried for years to push aside. It hadn't started this way. When Daniel first brought Brianna home, Margaret had been cautiously optimistic. Brianna was polite, warm even. She asked questions, laughed at Margaret's dry sense of humor, complimented the garden and said all the right things. Margaret had welcomed her with open arms. But the warmth didn't last. Looking back, Margaret saw the signs as clearly as chapter titles in one of her old novels. Subtle slights at first, declining dinner invitations at the last minute, insisting that holidays be spent, just the three of us. Then came the digs, carefully disguised as jokes. Oh, Margaret loves to control everything. It's a librarian thing, right? Or Daniel. Your mom's a bit too involved. Maybe she needs a hobby. Margaret had laughed politely. She didn't want to seem sensitive. She didn't want to lose her place. Then came the boundaries. Please text before dropping by. We're trying to have a screen-free weekend. The kids have a lot of activities. We'll see if we can squeeze in a visit. Margaret complied. Always complied. She brought cookies, sent cards, mailed thoughtful packages on birthdays. And when she was allowed a short visit, she smiled wide and kept her hands folded in her lap. Always careful not to say too much. Not to stay too long. Daniel never noticed. Or maybe he did and didn't want to see it. As Brianna tightened her grip on the household, Margaret felt her presence shrinking. Family dinners became rare. Phone calls became brief. FaceTime with the boys became, "We'll call you later," or "They're already in bed." There was always a reason. Always a polite excuse. And when Margaret expressed concern or confusion, Brianna was quick to twist the narrative. "She's acting strange again," Margaret overheard her once say on the phone. "I think she's lonely. It's sad, but she clings too much." That word, clingy, stuck in Margaret's throat like a splinter. It wasn't loneliness that made her want to be involved. It was love. A desire to be present, to watch her grandsons grow, to be part of Daniel's life even if only in the small moments. She had poured everything into raising him alone after his father passed away. She had given up promotions, turned down dates, worked double shifts to make sure he never lacked a thing. But somewhere along the way, Margaret's presence had become a problem to solve. And Brianna had offered Daniel the solution. Distance. Margaret didn't blame him entirely. He was overwhelmed working long hours trying to be a good father. He trusted his wife. That trust had become a wall between them. She remembered one particular day a year ago. She had surprised the family with tickets to a local children's theater show. She'd been so excited. Caleb loved dinosaurs and the play was about a time-traveling paleontologist. But when she showed up with the envelope in hand, Brianna had answered the door with a pinched smile. "Oh, we already have plans that day. But thank you." The tickets were never mentioned again. She'd later found them crumpled and unused on the console table. That small rejection had cut deeper than she'd admitted, even to herself. Now sitting alone with her tea gone cold, Margaret realized how much she had given up just to stay on the fringes of their lives. She had traded her voice for access, her boundaries for breadcrumbs, her pride for proximity, and still, it hadn't been enough. The dinner party had made that painfully clear. But maybe, just maybe, that night hadn't been the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning. Maybe the silence she had wrapped around herself like armor had finally split at the seams, and through that crack, light was finally coming in. She wouldn't let it close again. Margaret stood and poured the rest of her tea down the sink. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow I start taking myself back. The attic was stifling that afternoon, filled with the scent of old cardboard and cedar chests. Margaret Ellis climbed the narrow steps slowly, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a flashlight. She hadn't been up here in years. Dust floated in lazy streaks of sunlight through the slatted vent, and the air held the quiet weight of time. She wasn't sure what had pulled her up here. Maybe the need to distract herself. Or maybe something deeper. A quiet nudge from that persistent voice inside her that had begun whispering, "You're not powerless." She moved past old winter coats, baby clothes, and Daniel's high school trophies. Memories lay packed away in every corner. Weddings, birthdays, snow days. She paused at an unmarked file box tucked beneath an old quilt. It was heavier than she remembered, filled with paper folders and manila envelopes thick with documents. She settled on the floor and began sorting. Tax records, medical bills, letters from her late husband, Paul. Then, halfway through the stack, her fingers brushed a yellowed envelope, its edges curled and fragile. Across the front, in Paul's steady handwriting, it read, "Deed Chestnut Lane Property." Margaret's heart skipped. She opened the flap carefully. Inside were several neatly folded documents. Her eyes scanned the first page and immediately widened. It was the deed to the house Daniel and Brianna lived in. The very house Margaret had gifted them as a wedding present nearly 10 years ago. Or so she had thought. Paul had purchased the house shortly before his death. It had been intended as an investment property. But after his passing, Margaret couldn't bring herself to sell it. When Daniel and Brianna got married, they were struggling financially, and Margaret saw an opportunity to help. She'd handed them the key over dinner one night and said, "It's yours. Start your family here." She'd meant it. But now, staring at the deed, she realized something life-altering. The house was never legally transferred to Daniel's name. She rifled through the envelope, heart pounding. The property tax receipts were still addressed to her. The homeowner's insurance policy, the maintenance records, even the city utility history, all under her name. The implications hit her like a summer storm. She still legally owned the house. The house Brianna had thrown her out of like an unwanted guest. The house where Margaret had helped Daniel patch the roof after a storm. The house where she'd hung garlands for Christmas, baked cookies with her grandsons, brought soup when they were sick. Her house. She sat back on her heels, stunned. Had Daniel even known? Had he assumed the paperwork had gone through? Margaret doubted Brianna had ever asked. In her mind, it was hers now. Hers to decorate, hers to rule, hers to control. But it wasn't. Not legally. Not technically. Not at all. The tremble in Margaret's hands wasn't fear. It was energy, pure. Awakening energy. She carefully gathered the documents and tucked them into a sturdy file folder. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. No longer a guest in her own family story. No longer helpless. Later that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the papers laid out neatly beside her cup of tea, this one hot, untouched. Her mind replayed Brianna's words at the dinner party. The venom behind the smile, the humiliation Margaret had swallowed. And now, she understood the power she had unknowingly held all along. She didn't want revenge. But she did want truth. She wanted dignity. She wanted the line drawn and drawn firmly. And now she finally had the pen. The phone rang just after sunset on Sunday evening. Margaret had been sitting at her kitchen table, rereading the property documents for the third time, still unable to fully believe the truth of what she held in her hands. She answered without checking the caller ID. "Margaret? It's Claire. Claire Hammond, your son's neighbor." Margaret straightened. "Yes, of course. Is everything all right?" Claire hesitated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I wasn't sure whether to call, but I saw what happened at the dinner party. The whole block's been talking, and I thought you should know something." Margaret braced herself. "Go on." "I've seen Brianna with someone," Claire said carefully. "Not Daniel. A man. More than once." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret blinked. "What kind of someone?" "They've been meeting at that little cafe on Maple and Sycamore. Always around lunchtime. At first, I thought it might be work-related. But then last week, I saw them in his car. They weren't just talking." Claire didn't need to say more. Margaret closed her eyes. Her stomach turned. She'd known something was off, had felt it for a long time. Brianna's increasing coldness, the way she spoke to Daniel with polite contempt, her sudden bursts of temper. But this painted the entire picture in a new light. "Do you know who he is?" Margaret asked. "No name, but he drives a dark blue Audi. Sharp dresser. About 40, maybe older. They're not hiding it well." Margaret. And I thought you deserved to know. Thank you, Margaret whispered. Thank you for telling me. They hung up, and for a while Margaret just sat there, her hand resting on the phone. Her mind spinning. The house. The insults. The isolation. And now the affair. What if everything Brianna had done, turning Daniel against her, limiting contact with the boys, making her feel unstable, had been about control? About clearing space for her own secrets? Margaret had spent years trying not to make waves, trying to remain gracious and easy to be around. But she wasn't just dealing with a difficult personality anymore. She was staring into the face of betrayal. The next morning, Margaret woke with a plan. She dressed plainly, slipped her phone into her purse, and drove to the cafe Claire had mentioned. She parked across the street and waited, her nerves taut. At 12:17 p.m. Brianna arrived. She wore a bright yellow blouse and dark jeans, hair styled, makeup flawless. 10 minutes later, the man appeared. Tall, clean-shaven, exuding quiet confidence. They greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek. Too close to be professional. They ordered coffee, took a table on the patio, and leaned in to talk. Margaret stayed across the street, watching through the car window. It felt wrong and surreal, like watching a play where the villain had once been family. After 30 minutes, the two stood and walked together toward a side street. Margaret followed, careful, slow. She parked further down and stepped out just in time to see them pause by a sleek dark blue car. Brianna glanced around, paranoid, cautious. And then she kissed him. It wasn't a peck. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of kiss Margaret hadn't seen between Brianna and Daniel in years. She raised her phone and took the picture. 1, 2, 3. Then she sat back down in the car, her heart hammering, her hands shaking, not with fear but with conviction. This wasn't just a strained marriage or a meddling mother-in-law dynamic. Brianna had been crafting a story to justify her own guilt. Margaret had simply become a casualty of her lies. Back home, Margaret printed the photos and added them to the growing folder with the deed and property records. She stared at the evidence not with triumph, but with the steady calm of someone who knew what needed to be done. She would not be quiet anymore. She would not be erased. This time, Margaret Ellis was writing the ending. The rain tapped softly against the windows as Margaret sat at her writing desk, her fingers hovering above a sheet of cream stationery. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock, Paul's clock, steady and patient. The folder sat beside her, thick with truth. Copies of the deed, printouts of photos, neatly labeled evidence. Everything she needed was there. But the most important part had yet to be written. Her hands didn't shake. She dipped her pen in ink. Not a ballpoint. Not typed, but handwritten in her clear, deliberate script. This wasn't a rant. It wasn't revenge. It was something far more powerful, clarity. Brianna, by the time you finish reading this letter, I expect the balance in our relationship will have shifted. There are 3 things you need to know. First, the house you live in, the one you threw me out of during your dinner party, is still legally mine. I never transferred the deed. I have attached current property records and insurance documentation, all in my name. I never intended to weaponize this oversight. I trusted Daniel and, by extension, you. But I've now come to understand that this trust was not returned. Second, I know about the affair. I know about the man you meet at the cafe on Maple. I know about the hotel. I've enclosed photographic evidence, which I will not yet share with Daniel, though I reserve the right to do so if you continue to weaponize his trust and use the children as leverage. Third, I have spent years diminishing myself, absorbing insults, accepting your coldness, all for the sake of staying close to my son and my grandchildren. But I will not do that anymore. I will not be humiliated. I will not be silenced. And I will not be erased. You have 2 options. You can choose to end the affair, seek the help your marriage clearly needs, and begin treating me with the baseline respect every human being deserves. Or you can continue down the path you've chosen, but you will do so without the security of living in my home. You have until Friday to decide. After that, I will begin formal proceedings to reclaim my property and tell Daniel everything I know. This isn't vengeance. It's accountability. And it's long overdue. Margaret. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, slipping it into the envelope along with the enclosed documents. She sealed it, pressed it flat, and placed it on the kitchen counter. The power in that envelope didn't come from threats. It came from truth, the kind that no longer needed to be shouted to be heard. That night, Margaret slept without waking.
No restless passing. No midnight tears.
For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her feet again. On Monday morning, she dressed with intention. A soft gray cardigan, pearl earrings, and polished black flats. Not a costume of strength, but a reflection of it. She looked in the mirror before leaving the house and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she was different, because she was finally herself again. Margaret drove to Daniel and Brianna's home, her home technically, and parked at the curb. She knew Daniel would be at work and the children at school. That was by design. Brianna answered the door in yoga pants and a fitted sweatshirt, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her expression flickered from surprise to annoyance. "Margaret," she said flatly. "What are you?" "I won't stay," Margaret said calmly, holding out the envelope. "This is for you." Brianna looked down at the envelope, then back up. "What is this supposed to be?" Margaret didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. Behind her, she heard the door shut, and she knew, by the time Brianna finished reading, the game would be over. This was no longer about pleasing anyone. This was Margaret reclaiming everything that had been taken. And the clock was ticking. Margaret hadn't expected to hear anything for a few days. She imagined Brianna pacing the house, seething, calculating her next move. But it didn't take that long. By Tuesday evening, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was quiet, tight. "Mom, I need to talk. Can I come over?" "Of course," Margaret said, her heart already bracing. He arrived half an hour later, the children asleep in the back seat of the car. Margaret stepped outside just in time to see him unbuckle their booster seats and carry them inside one by one. He didn't say a word until both were tucked into her guest room. Then, in the living room, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. "She admitted it," he said, his voice hollow. "Not right away. First she said you faked it. That you forged the pictures. Then she said it was my fault. That I'd grown distant. That she was lonely." Margaret sat across from him, a blanket folded neatly in her lap. She said nothing. She let him speak. "And then she said the house isn't even ours. That you tricked us. That you're trying to steal our life out from under us." He looked up, eyes rimmed with disbelief. "Is that true?" "I never tricked anyone," Margaret said softly. "When your father bought the property, it was meant to be an investment. After he passed, I didn't have the heart to sell it. I kept it. When you got married, I gave you the key as a gift. But I forgot. Or maybe I just never followed through with the paperwork. There was no scheme, Daniel. Just a grieving mother doing what she thought was right." He nodded slowly. "I believe you. I do. I think deep down I always knew she had stretched the truth. But the affair, the lies, the way she treated you. I feel like I've been asleep for 5 years." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "You've been surviving. Trying to keep your family together." Daniel rubbed his eyes. "She screamed at me. Said I was throwing everything away. That I was choosing you over her." "And what did you say?" "I told her I was choosing my children. And myself. That I couldn't raise them in a house where love was conditional and truth was negotiable." Margaret let that settle between them. She saw the weight on her son's shoulders. Heavier now that he had taken his first real step away. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said. "This house has room and love for all of you." He exhaled, his posture softening. "Thank you, Mom. I don't deserve this." "You do," she said firmly. "You always have." Over the following days, the transition began quietly. Margaret cleared out the back room for Daniel, setting up Emma and James in her sewing space and guest nook. They brought only essentials, clothes, school supplies, a few cherished toys. No drama, no theatrics. Brianna's texts came in waves, first angry, then apologetic, then threatening. Daniel ignored them. His lawyer advised him to keep records but not respond. Margaret focused on the children. She filled their mornings with laughter and pancakes, their evenings with bedtime stories and calming routines. Emma asked when they'd go home. James cried for his mother. Margaret never spoke poorly of Brianna. She answered gently, "We're just staying with Grandma for a while. Grown-ups are working things out." Daniel noticed. "You're doing for them what you did for me," he said one night as they washed dishes together. "Giving them normal when everything else feels upside down." Margaret smiled, drying a plate. "That's what grandmothers are for." The house, once too quiet, was now brimming with life again. Toys underfoot, crayon drawings on the fridge, the smell of baked casseroles in the oven. But more than that, it was brimming with healing. For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't just a figure on the periphery. She was the anchor, the steady hand, the safe place. And as Daniel tucked his kids in at night, kissed them goodnight, and walked back to sit beside his mother with a tired smile, Margaret knew the damage Brianna caused had been deep, but the roots of their family were deeper. And now, they were growing back stronger together. 2 months had passed since Daniel and the children moved in with Margaret. The days settled into a rhythm. Emma and James adapted quickly to their new routines, and Daniel began seeing a family therapist. Margaret found unexpected joy in this new phase of life. Her quiet mornings were now filled with tiny voices, mismatched socks, and sleepy hugs. Her house, once a museum of silence, now breathed with purpose again. But the healing was not linear. Some days, Daniel still woke up in disbelief. Some nights Emma cried for her mother. Margaret held them all steady, but she also made space for her own feelings. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was dim with lamplight, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for what had happened, but for the years she had allowed herself to feel small and unwanted. It was on a breezy Thursday afternoon that the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it and found Brianna standing on the porch, clutching a cardigan to her chest. Gone were the polished heels and lipsticked confidence. Her eyes were puffy, her posture uncertain. "Hi," she said. I know I should have called first. I didn't know if you'd even open the door." Margaret studied her in silence for a long moment. Then quietly she stepped aside. "Come in." Brianna entered slowly, as if stepping into a memory she wasn't sure still belonged to her. Margaret gestured to the sofa, but remained standing. "I won't stay long," Brianna said quickly. I owe you an apology. A real one." Margaret nodded but didn't speak. She waited. "I've been in therapy," Brianna said. "A lot. More than I ever thought I'd need. First I blamed everyone, you, Daniel, even the kids. But I see it now. The way I treated you. It was cruel. I was jealous. Insecure. I saw your bond with Daniel and felt threatened by it, instead of grateful. And instead of working through that, I made you the enemy." Her voice broke. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I was wrong, Margaret. Deeply wrong. The dinner party. What I did was unforgivable. And still you gave me more grace than I ever deserved." Margaret's throat tightened, but she kept her voice even. "You're right about one thing. You were cruel. You humiliated me in front of my family, and you lied for years about who I was to Daniel. I lived in fear of losing the only people I had left." Brianna nodded slowly. "I know. But here's the thing," Margaret continued, finally sitting down across from her. "I'm not accepting this apology because I want things to go back to how they were. They can't. Too much has changed. I understand. I'm accepting because I'm no longer the woman who cowered in the corner of her own life. I've reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my place in this family. I'm accepting because I believe people can grow. And maybe, just maybe, you're beginning to." Brianna's shoulders trembled as she exhaled. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I just needed you to know. I'm sorry. And if there's ever a day when I'm allowed to be a small part of the kids' lives again, I'll be grateful." Margaret rose and walked her to the door. "That's not my decision anymore. It's Daniel's. But I'll say this, children know when people are trying. So if you keep showing up with honesty and humility, maybe one day you'll earn your place again." As Brianna stepped off the porch, Margaret felt an unexpected lightness. Not forgiveness for Brianna's sake, but a peace she had made with herself. This wasn't weakness. It was strength wearing softness. Later that night, Margaret told Daniel about the visit. He didn't say much, just nodded and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." And in that quiet acknowledgement, Margaret knew she had helped build the bridge back from brokenness. But only because she had stopped apologizing for being strong. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over Margaret's breakfast table. Emma and James had just left for school with Daniel, and for the first time that morning the house was quiet. Not the heavy silence she once dreaded, but a peaceful pause. A gentle breath before the day unfolded. She wrapped her hands around a warm mug of tea, and let her eyes wander across the room. The once dusty shelves now held drawings, half-finished school projects, and photo frames filled with laughter. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, a rhythm that had accompanied her through heartbreak and healing. Margaret Ellis, 68, retired librarian, mother and grandmother, had finally returned to herself. There had been a time not long ago when she questioned her worth, when cruel words thrown across a dinner table had made her feel like an unwelcome relic, a nuisance. She remembered the icy clatter of a plate shattered at her feet, the dismissive sneer of her daughter-in-law, and the painful silence of her only son. But those days were behind her now. Not erased, never erased, but transformed. It had taken courage to face the truth. That Brianna had manipulated her. That Daniel had failed to protect her. That years of subtle isolation had worn her down. But what had once been a quiet ache in her heart had become the fire that lit her path forward. Margaret stood up and walked to her writing desk by the window, where a small stack of handwritten letters waited. Messages from women who had heard about her story through the local community center's storytelling group. She had shared her journey at a small reading one afternoon, hesitant at first. But what began as a trembling voice grew stronger with each sentence. She didn't name names. She didn't seek pity. She simply told the truth. And it resonated. The letters came from women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, who had spent years feeling invisible, dismissed, devalued. They thanked her for showing them that dignity doesn't come from permission. It comes from within. One letter read, "After hearing your story, I called my daughter for the first time in months and told her how I really felt. I thought I'd be met with anger. Instead, she cried and said she never knew. Thank you for reminding me I still matter." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes stinging with tears. She hadn't set out to become anyone's example. She had just wanted peace. But somewhere along the way, her pain became power, not just for her but for others too. That afternoon she walked through the garden, now filled with new blooms planted by Emma and James. She knelt down, gently patting the soil around a budding rosebush. For years she tended gardens alone, finding solace in their quiet growth. Now they were symbols of renewal, shared and joyful. Her story wasn't one of revenge. It was one of reclamation. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't stormed out. She had gathered facts, wrote her truth, and handed it to the woman who had tried to silence her. She had let strength speak, not volume. And when Brianna returned to apologize, Margaret had listened, not because she had to, but because she could. She knew now that accepting an apology didn't mean forgetting the hurt. It meant choosing peace over bitterness. Boundaries, not barriers. Later that week, at her next storytelling circle, Margaret stood before a small group of women at the community hall. Her voice was steady, clear. "I want you to know something," she said, looking into their eyes. "You are not too old to be respected. You are not too old to speak your truth. And you are certainly not too old to begin again." Heads nodded. Some wiped tears. "I spent too many years trying not to rock the boat, trying to be the quiet helper. But the day I stood up for myself, everything changed. Not because others gave me permission, but because I stopped asking for it." When the group dispersed, a woman in her 70s approached. "Margaret, you've given me more than hope. You've given me direction." Margaret smiled and took her hand. "No one gets to write us off," she said. "Not while we still have stories to tell." As she walked home beneath the evening sky, Margaret knew her journey had only just begun. Not in the way of youth, but in the wisdom of late blooming. And she was ready for every chapter still to come. What do we owe ourselves when the world tries to silence our worth? Margaret's story reminds us that age does not diminish dignity, And silence should never be mistaken for weakness. For years, she endured emotional isolation, subtle manipulation, and overt disrespect, all to preserve her connection with the people she loved most. But when she rediscovered her voice, she didn't just reclaim her place in the family, she redefined it. Her quiet strength, steady courage, and unwavering self-respect transformed not only her circumstances, but the emotional landscape of her entire household. This is a story not about revenge, but restoration. About boundaries drawn not in bitterness, but in wisdom. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt pushed aside, unheard, or underestimated. Margaret shows us that it's never too late to speak up, to reclaim what's ours, and to rewrite the ending with grace and clarity. For those of us in the later chapters of life, her journey raises an important question. What might change if we stopped waiting to be invited to matter, and instead chose to stand tall in our truth? Respect isn't something we age out of. It's something we reinforce each time we remember who we are. So, what chapter are you writing next? And who might need to hear the story only you can tell?